Hey, it's Kelly with Rogue MFA, and today I'm going to talk to you about the documents that I set up every time I start a historical fiction project. Over on Substack, I have outlined for you about 5 of them, plus an entire checklist if you want to get that. But today we're going to go through those top 5. And the first one that I want to talk about is primary sources, and really how do we keep track of all of the research that we're doing on top of just simply telling our story. And that sometimes can feel overwhelming. It can feel like it kind of takes over the project itself. So the first document that I always start with is called primary sources. The way that we're going to kind of keep the madness contained is that I often put in headers in that document itself that talk about things like an event, real historical figures, right? A piece of artwork, how something works technically, things in the zeitgeist that I need to know about. Whatever it is that your story is really about, you're going to want to break down those elements so it's easier for you to find the material that you need as you go or to answer those questions. And it really functions a lot like a bibliography where you're doing the bibliography things like the title, the link to where you found the article or the document, the book, whatever it is, the image that you're referencing. But where you're going to save yourself a massive amount of time is by including what I like to call a memory spark. And that is, what was it about that particular item that you're wanting to reference that you remember? So sometimes I can be a really good procrastinator through research, and I will end up reading 10 articles about something, and it starts to get muddy. It's like, which one said what about what? But if I have a memory spark, beneath the title, it will say something like, this is the one that talked about burial practices of witchcraft in Bulgaria. And then I'm like, where they drove the stake through their chest to pin them to the ground, right? Like that is something that I've actually read for another project. And I'm like, oh, right, that's that one. And it also jogs my memory that they were talking about that all across Eastern Europe. And there were other practices in there that's probably the article that I'm going to need for this part of the book that I'm writing, right? So that will be really helpful for you going forward. The next one is character templates. Now, if you're using something like Scrivener, they have built-in character templates, and that's like really helpful. But you also want those, particularly if you're writing about real historical figures, because you want to know like how they lived and moved. And when we know how a person is, it's easier for us to leverage their idiosyncrasies, the things that we would think are surprising about them, and to keep continuity throughout the novel. It's also an easy way to see if you have minor characters who are all kind of doing the same work in the story, but you are asking the reader to keep track of 3 different characters doing that work, and how can you compress them maybe into 1 or 2, still kind of do that same work, but aren't as taxing on the reader. So you'll want to keep track of that. But the other thing that we need to consider too within those character templates is what's called the character tree. And you've seen a bunch of these, like in the beginning of Wolf Hall, for example. There's a big outline in that entire trilogy of who's who, like which family, which faction they kind of belong to, what their role is, how they're related. And it helps the reader, particularly if you're writing something that is maybe generational, something with a huge cast of characters is really something we want to think about. So your reader can familiarize themselves with the people before we get thrown into the story. And so they can kind of go back and go, wait a second, was that, particularly in Hilary Mantel, was that this Thomas or that Thomas? If you've read them, you know. So it's really helpful just for the reader and for yourself, again, to make sure that everyone's pulling their weight. The other document that I start without fail is a timeline, because I want to know if I'm setting this at a particular time, how much time, and if I'm using real historical events or fictional events, I'm going to want to pin those onto that timeline so I can see where I have gaps in time or where I might have a big pileup of events that are happening in the story. And have I started the story too early, right? Like if I have a bunch of stuff going on, does it make more sense to start closer to that or to fill something in? The timeline is really helpful. And it also keeps your research constrained. So you're not, well, hopefully not going down as many bunny holes when you see something interesting. You're like, no, I gotta stay within this particular time frame. Another document that I always start is called Story Snatches, and that is usually, how did this story arrive to me? What was the inspiration for it? Was it a piece of artwork? Was it a documentary? Was it some dialogue that was downloaded? Was it, for me, often a story will come to me and it's usually the most climactic event of the story. And so I write that down in as much detail as I possibly can, because my job then is to reverse engineer how we got there. So if that happens to you, it's always handy to have that document where as you continue to get inspiration or as things come to you, you can just kind of put them in that document so they're safe somewhere and go back to them as you need. Because sometimes I don't stay married to the idea that originally came to me. The story is kind of taking on its own form, but it does help me with inspiration to remember things that were important in the beginning, kind of help get me through certain parts of the story that might feel like they're dragging or that I'm struggling with. And then the last one, and this one, if you are really into the research, which if you're writing historical fiction, I know you are, is called Things I'm Gonna Need Help Figuring Out, or Things I'm Gonna Need Help Researching. And in that document is more of a conversational document where I will say things like, how do I figure out how the kitchen worked in a medieval setting in England? Or how do I figure out what the fastest mode of transportation was between point A and point B at this particular time, given these circumstances? How do I figure out, right? It's when I have Googled myself into oblivion. And usually for me, I'm in an academic library or I'm doing something more like that. But when I have, or an archive, but when I've kind of hit a dead end and I don't know, this document also serves as your question list for when you inevitably, and you're going to do this, go to your local library and ask the librarians there, because they are the most underutilized, most amazing resource that you have at your fingertips. And so when you take that question in and you're saying, how do I figure out how this particular thing would have worked in time, they can then start to point you toward resources, because they understand exactly the types of documents, the databases that you have access to, the books within the library system itself that might be able to help get you that answer. So I'm hoping that helps you set up your documents so you can kind of keep the chaos contained and then make sure that your story is, you're doing like really good service to your story. Anyway, so for the whole list, again, head back over to Substack. I've got the list there and a bigger checklist. I hope that helps. Talk to you later.